Hi, I'm John Coggan. I'm Professor of Law in the Centre for Health, Law and Society at the University of Bristol Law School, and I'm a part of the UK Pandemic Ethics Accelerator. The Ethics Accelerator has brought ethical perspectives to bear on the big questions that governments, communities, organisations and individuals across the UK have faced since the onset of the pandemic. In May 2022, we brought together experts from academia, the law, public health, medical publishing, journalism, and formal and informal advisory roles to policymakers to reflect on their experiences of the pandemic and what we had learned about the place of values in public policy and decision making. In this film, our speakers discuss how our leaders engaged or failed to engage in the ethical complexities of pandemic decision making and on why this matters.
I think what we're learning is that, ethics really is part of everyday pandemic life, and that decision-making during a pandemic is essentially ethical across multiple societal levels.
It's really important that we reflect on the roles in which and the ways in which more attention can be brought to bear on the ethical dimensions of policy, and in particular to those questions, or recognition of the fact that many of the policy decisions that need to be made are or have as a key part of them value judgments.
There is no one right answer to most of the questions that arise here, but there are ways of thinking about these questions in coherent, reasonable ways. And you can do that from different ethical angles. And those different ethical approaches may take you to different positions on what the right thing is to do. But for us, the point is that those positions are traceable, they're transparent, and that transparency does lead to better decision making.
I think transparency is incredibly important in all of this, but we felt at the beginning that it was not acceptable in a representative democracy for decisions to be made on the basis of following the science, which was really prominent if we could not see what the science was.
The policy making, although the government regularly said it was based on science, they were following the science, it wasn't clear what that science was. So I think the test of transparency and openness was thoroughly failed.
The things that were not clear to me were how UK decisions had been arrived at, the values and the thinking that were underpinning them.
Values are incredibly important in informing decision making. And one of the key things that we're seeing from the pandemic, but also the global financial crisis, is what is it as a society that we value, and how do we use that to center our decision making?
I think the key thing for me is that the values should, as far as possible, be made explicit. There are lots of situations in which the values actually clash. And in particular, I'm thinking about autonomy and reciprocity. I also think that they need to be made explicit in terms of our responsibility for others as to who we are, who others are. Who are we? Who are they? Because, of course, that has all sorts of issues in reinforcing and generating inequalities.
There seemed to be no explicit discussion about the rights and wrongs of exposing frontline health workers to an unknown virus. And just really, again, this idea that many decisions during the pandemic were underpinned by unclear objectives, opaque criteria, a lack of transparency and inconsistency. So, for example, it was very unclear to me what was driving the policies on masking, and particularly dropping masking. Was it infection numbers, vaccination rates, or was it political pressure? Another ethical issue that came up that bothered me was the fact that early in 2020 it was becoming very clear that marginalised groups, particularly ethnic minorities, were more likely to become infected, and once infected were at higher risk of bad outcomes.
We know that COVID mortality in England was more than twice as high in the most deprived areas compared to the least deprived areas. But this was acutely problematic for working age people. So those younger than 65 in the most deprived areas were 4 times more likely to succumb to the virus than those in the least deprived areas.